Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to make another video on the Peugeot-Weinstein conversation. Um, I just have still more to say, particularly in terms of Bret Weinstein's religion. Now, again, religion is sort of defined in a secular realm as something that pertains to gods up in the sky, holy books, going to church, synagogue, or temple, indulging in narratives that are supposed to help you get into heaven or get into the future or have success in the world, something of this nature. And those of you who've been following the channel for a while know that this word religion is highly contended. A video that I play with regularity is this Classics for All video. Tom Holland did Religion Exist in the Ancient World? Well, why? Well, because we look back and say, oh, they're enormously religious. They have temples, they have gods, they have sacrifices. In fact, the more you study the ancient world, the more religious they all become. You discover that the Olympic Games weren't just sort of these games by which people were competing for prizes, but this had everything to do with their religious life. In fact, everything in the ancient world was religious, or at least looked religious to us, even though they didn't have the word religion like we do. They didn't have the category of religion. That all, of course, develops well after the Enlightenment. Now, Weinstein, in the previous video, mentioned back in the video where he and Peugeot and Peterson were talking, he pretty much says it right here.
My point is, you have 1,000 different belief systems. They're all built out of metaphorical truths and a certain amount of real truth. Let's just stick science in with the rest of them. It's belief system 1001. Okay, now let's say, well, which of these is best? How are you even going to do that? There's only one of them that has a distinct characteristic. It's number 1001. What's its distinct characteristic? It explains why all the others work. So how is it not, just by virtue of the fact that it does something that nothing else can, how is it not the top one in the hierarchy?
So he basically says, well, science is the one belief system that explains how all of the other belief systems work. And again, I'm not going to retread what I did in the previous two videos on this. But basically, we talked about the fact that science gets down to tiny little causal relationships and tries to scale up those causal relationships into a whole mesh of knowledge. In some ways, this is sort of foundationalism built on tiny little interactions, and you can just build up from there. Now, nobody expects you to actually build up from there, but that in theory you can build up from there, and this is where we get into this idea of emergence, so that theoretically you can follow all the little mechanisms in emergence all the way up after the fact and then arrive at something. And the hope of arriving at this, and the goal of arriving at this, is that you can get at this thing called prediction. Now, prediction is obviously based on consciousness, because we sort of make a prediction in our mind and then imagine this is going to happen and then await the prediction to come. And that's sort of how science is calculated. It's verifiable. And so if we have water and if we have electricity and we put the electricity into water in a certain way, we'll get hydrogen and oxygen. And before you even did the experiment, you can tell what's going to come out of the experiment, and then poof, now you know you have truth. But as in the previous two videos we talked about, one of the issues is the frame question, where you have to basically say, well, you're looking for a particular truth, such as hydrogen and oxygen, and you're not saying, well, if we put electricity into the water and then I stick my hand in there, I get electrocuted. No, that wasn't the experiment. We're looking for hydrogen and water, not the way electricity and water, throw the toaster into the tub and then get in the tub and we're looking for hydrogen and oxygen. No, you're not going to be looking for anything at all, because you're going to be dead. The world is a very complex place. Now, what Bret says is that science is the only, now all of these other systems are metaphorical systems. Science is the only system. Now go back to the first of these three videos where that has C.S. Lewis's Miracles on the cover, where we talk about the fact that basically any language is a metaphorical appropriation, and in a sense, what you try to do is get at very simple very simple, discrete relationships and make sure that those relationships stay, and then look at certain processes within certain variables such as time, and then you have certain predictable outcomes. There's science. But how does that really go in the world? Now, obviously, what Bret just said here is pretty foundational to his belief, but he's going to scale it up, and he's going to make some really astounding claims in this video right here.
But my point to you would be a proper evolutionary understanding of religious phenomena not only explains the nature of religions, things like mechanisms that frustrate individual profit at the expense of the collective, right? Those are adaptive. But it also predicts the failure of religions that do not successfully do this, and it predicts the divergence of religions, right?
Now, this is just words that he's putting out here, but just pause for a moment and consider the size of this claim. In fact, you might even not only just consider the size of the claim, but ask him to actually put up here. Because what he's basically claiming is that you can use these evolutionary tools and this knowledge that we gain from evolution, and you can predict the pathways of religion. Now, again, we're using religion in terms of the secular viewpoint of what a religion is. You have both groups, you have lineages. We talked a little bit about that before, and you can predict where they're going. Now, what's remarkable about this is that we have a great deal of difficulty predicting just about anything. And right now, there's all sorts of desire to predict where the economy is going to go, where the stock market is going to go, where the housing market is going to go, what's going to happen in the Ukraine war. In fact, predicting almost anything, usually what we do is we wait until something has happened, and then we sort of rummage through all of the people, all of the pundits who have said something about it, and look for the one person who got it right. And then, like Nate Silver, for example, who predicted Obama's election. And ever since Nate Silver predicted Obama's election, everybody's been sort of beating a path to Nate Silver's door, except that, of course, Nate Silver very famously predicted that Hillary Clinton would be president. But that didn't mean that Nate Silver sort of got dropped from all of us paying attention to him. The business of prediction is a pretty complex matter. And the business of religious prediction? Now, my only appearance on Unbelievable was with James Croft, who, it was a lovely conversation. I'd never met him before. He was a tremendous amount of fun. And he is a leader of one of the more successful godless congregations in his tradition, which is a bit over 100 years old. And in this conversation, one of the things that he expressed his frustration about is that his group should be thriving right now. And Sam Harris was talking to Glenn Lowry, basically saying that, well, what we really need are supernatural religions, and these can really help us go into the future, because we have atheists who have finally shucked off all of those stupid old superstitions such as God and that Iron Age book and all of those things, but we've realized that we really need community and we really need support, and we need to take the best of civilization, and we should celebrate that, and we should get together at regular times to reinforce these ideas, and it's people have been trying this since Auguste Comte, the father of sociology, basically tried this. And there's been the Sunday celebrations. I forget what the latest atheist iteration of this has been. And these have all been just absolutely complete failures. And so if there's one area that is really difficult to predict, and I mean I'll even give you predictions over the very long term. People have been predicting the end of religion for a very long time. Now, they might look around in America and see declining rates of church participation and say, see, it is finally going away. it was believed to have gone away about 100 years ago, and the predictions of 100 years ago don't look anything like the predictions do now. And so this evolution predicts the behavior of religions, I suppose only in the broadest possible category. But again, you're working sort of from a foundationalist system that says, well, here are the foundations, and this is the way it's going to be laid out. Now, of course, I don't want to lean too hard on him, because evolutionary timescales are very, very long. But yeah, it's an awfully big claim. Now, part of what we talked about in the previous video is this issue of levels of analysis, because he basically asserts that the gene level is sort of the level at which all of the major work is going to be happening. And so if you pay attention to that level, well, it's at that level that a lot of the stuff is, that's why you can predict it, because it's the most foundational level. And of course, in the last video, there's a fair amount of question about that.
So what I'm arguing is it's possible to overdraw this. If you simply say, oh, religions are like species, right? And, there's a speciation event at which, Christians depart from Jews, and another one at which Protestants depart from Catholics. That's true at one level. It is not perfectly analogous to genetic speciation. But that if one follows the logic carefully, there is actually a toolkit that predicts all of these events and describes why some work better than others.
And again, this is an astounding claim, and I don't know why we don't just all fall over when he says such a thing. But it's like, wow. I know a good number of religious people that would love to hear your predictions. I think we'll probably be a little dubious that they'll come true. And chances are, on an evolutionary scale, you're going to make predictions that we'll all be dead and forgotten before these predictions come true or don't come true. But the track record of making these kind of predictions is absolutely dismal. And, one might have asked, because this is a guy who's had a rather climactic event in the middle of his life that is the reason that he's talking on YouTube instead of teaching at a college in the Pacific Northwest. Did evolutionary biology predict that? Now, I'm not trying to be a troll here, but it's a matter of trying to get an idea about what we're talking about. Because more and more I sit down and I ask myself, with many of these conversations, what exactly are we talking about? What exactly are we fighting about? What is it exactly that we want?
That effectively, understanding what job is being accomplished by these structures tells you how they are likely to behave, in the same way that looking at organisms and understanding their ecology predicts how they will respond to certain kinds of change.
And when you use the word better, what is it that you're referring to?
Well, I would say that evolution, if we do the work properly, what Darwinian evolution favors is lodging a particular set of genes, and I know that word will show up strangely here, but I will defend it if need be, lodging a particular set of genetic spellings as deeply into the future as possible.
Okay, so there in many ways is basically the foundation of his religion. And we talked about the fact that this, as my friend Sam had noted, this, when you start thinking this through, it's surprisingly similar to, let's say, certain forms of Gnosticism, where the genes are this demiurge that simply want to make their way into the future. Now, again, you have the level of analysis. So let's say all these genes are on one particular planet, and let's imagine that there's a huge asteroid strike and wipes out everything on that planet. You have to ask a question about the level of agency with those genes with respect to, let's say, the level of agency that a giant asteroid may strike a planet that has these genes and they can all go poof. So you've got that question. In other words, in some ways, the genes sound almost divine, almost omnipotent, but within ever larger scales of reference, not so much. Now Peugeot sort of challenges him on this question of good, because you might pause and say, well, for this evil demiurge being the genes that want to get their particular genetic spellings and codes into the future, we might ask ourselves, well, what would be good to them or good for them? And obviously the goal of this, and we haven't even really dealt with this whole question of teleology or purpose in here, but their goal functionally, mindlessly, would be to get into the future. Why would they have this goal? I have no idea. Do they have consciousness of this goal? I don't think we have a panpsychist in the group. But this is their functional goal, to get their spellings into the future, and that's what would be good. But now, when he says good, he doesn't mean that, because there's another layer here of what's going on. Well, let's let him finish here. So,
in other words, what select of strangely here, but that evolution, if we do the work properly, what Darwinian evolution favors is lodging a particular set of genes, and I know that word will show up strangely here, but I will defend it if need be, lodging a particular set of genetic spellings as deeply into the future as possible. In other words, what selection favors is the persistence of genetic spellings, and that the measure of it is how, the duration of that persistence. Ideally, selection would favor indefinite persistence. Indefinite persistence is an unattainable, and so it basically shapes things like creatures and things like lineages such that they become durable.
Okay, so now there's another big complexity in this that he isn't paying any attention to, because again, with this levels of analysis, you have to ask the question, well, how are you talking about my light colored eyes or my baldness? I mean, the baldness genes are just, making their way into the future. Hair be damned. How about this luxurious beard? What about the gap between my front teeth? Are all of these genes hitching a ride? Are they working together? Are they against each other? Are the dark-eyed genes in competition with the light-eyed genes? Even if you take it down, let's say another level, looking at the competition between genes, which I think would certainly be part of the package here, there's another level of analysis. And of course, good for the light-eyed genes would be to outcompete those of the dark-eyed genes. But of course, let's say light-eyed and pale skin versus dark eyes and darker skin. But of course, those are also functions of a context. And here in California, where the sun shines all the time, my light eyes that tend to be a little bit more photosensitive, and my pale skin that allows me to make vitamin D. But again, that's only one aspect of my skin. That is in many ways serving me as a disadvantage, especially with respect to the baldness, because I've seen plenty of Dutch guys in California by about the time they get my age and older, the skin on the top of their head looks really bad, and they're always going in for cancer checking with the skin on the top of their head, which is why I am very conscious about wearing a hat almost every time I go outside. So there's a lot of complexity. Now, I appreciate the fact that what we're trying to do here is trying to scale things down, and we sort of have to ask why. What is this all about? Now, and because in many respects, that's what religion tries to do. Religion doesn't just try to say what's better or worse. There's a value hierarchy there that they want to pursue, and that says that things like, well, baldness and light eye color and pale skin are probably, in the great scheme of things, not that important. And religions try to help you figure out, well, what exactly is important. Now, the rest is history. This week, I'm a member of the Rest is History Club. Here's a little free advertising for Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook and their wonderful podcast, as if I had to promote them any more than I've already done. But hey, I love it. And what human beings like to do is share what they love. Well, this week, fun crossover, they had Dan Carlin on the show. And if you're part of the Rest is History Club, you get the whole week's worth podcast right off the bat, which is really rather nice. Because whereas part 1, which is available today on the regular stream, was good, part 2 was really good. And part of what's fun about this particular conversation, I'm not going to play it because it's not fully available yet, is because they ask a lot of much bigger questions. At one point, Tom Holland basically, you can tell which questions are Dominic Sandbrook's questions because they're very wide open and ranging, and which questions are Tom Holland's questions because they're often multiple choice questions. But at one point, he basically asks the question, would you rather be a French nobleman basically at the eve of the Black Death, or a British aristocracy basically at the eve of the First World War, or Lakota Sioux basically at the end of the American Civil War? And these are fun questions because they force someone to say, well, what is good? Well, maybe the French aristocracy may things will go well if they have a durable enough immune system, they'll survive the Black Death, and maybe that will go well. If the British aristocracy can keep from getting killed in the First World War, probably have a nicer standard of living, the Lakota Sioux is going to be there to watch not only the wars with the American cavalry, but probably watch their entire way of life and civilization get wiped out. But then you go back to that question, well, which is better? And we struggle to ask, well, better for what? And these are exactly the kinds of things that religions wrestle with. Now, Peugeot is making the point that best not to focus just on the genetic level. Best to, in fact, have a broader expanse where you can sort of come up above and look at many of the different levels and express some agency and volition in terms of choosing which levels of analysis, whereas Bret seems to continue to focus on that most basic level.
So let's use a word that is maybe more general. So you would say that the process favors the persistence of patterns, right? The persistence of patterns that persist, right? Like that tend to persist longer and on than others, or have more capacity to self-perpetuate.
Yeah, except there's a giant hazard in the way you've just described it. Okay, so if you, I had a conversation with Dawkins in Chicago in what must have been 2018. And it became clear in this conversation, Dawkins is the inventor of the term meme. And the idea of meme is, I regard it as one of the most important innovations of the latter half of the 20th century. It is the key to understanding humans. But the way Dawkins understands it, memes are an analogous space to genes. Right? That basically, and he, in fact, in chapter 11 of The Selfish Gene, where he introduces the idea, he says that memes are effectively a new primeval soup. And he says it has similar rules to the rules that govern the evolution of genes. Now, this is an error. I don't fault him for the error. Everybody makes errors as they introduce an important new hypothesis. But he never corrected it, and nobody else did either. And the problem is...
Now, first, before we get too far here, let's pay attention to what's happened. Because we have all these nucleotides, we have these proteins, this matter that has been reacting with itself. And the picture, of course, is one of emergence. It's the whole show. This has all been developing up from first you have the Big Bang, and then you have the cooling, and then you have somehow the development of organic chemistry, and out of organic chemistry comes life. And of course, you can just check for James Tour on YouTube, and he'll say, we have absolutely no idea how any of these jumps happened, by the way. But anyway, so you have all this emergence up and up and up and up and up, and all this matter. And now, of course, you get to these memes, which are immaterial. So they're upper register. They're immaterial, and these are functioning similarly to the matter down below. Now he's not. Now, in some ways, they're dependent on the matter, but I guess the question is going to be, to what degree are they dependent on which properties of the matter, and those properties are playing themselves out in the immaterial, let's say.
Memes do not have the same status as genes. It's not a parallel realm. Memes, cultural evolution, is a mechanism by which genes solve a certain problem.
Now, before we get too far, let's just pay attention to the language. Memes are do you remember what I already said? Mechanism. What do you mean they're a mechanism? Words are gears. Well, that doesn't sound right. Memes are a mechanism. That's a very odd thing to say. It's deeply metaphorical. I don't know if he would say that this is metaphorical truth, but it's deeply metaphorical, but it's, again, the only language we have. Memes are hydraulic hoses. Memes are rubber on dirt. So memes are mechanisms.
Right? Cultural evolution, because culture can flow horizontally, it can evolve much more rapidly than genes, right? Genes are setting up a mind in a creature like a human being that is amenable to cultural evolution because that solves a genetic problem.
Okay, and here is the basis of his religion. Now, you can hear this little story from Bret again and again and again and again and again and again and again. He keeps telling this little story. This is at the heart of his explanatory power of his religion, that the genes, this evil demiurge, that all it wants to do is get it spelling into the future. What these things have done is these things have created this creature that is capable of memes, that is capable of this secondary level, the cultural level. And again, this is roughly analogous to the lower register and the upper register, the cultural level, which works far more quickly than the genetic level. Now, this is where all of this thinking and all of this language about purpose gets really interesting, because he basically makes the argument that genes set up their own demise. And you really have to sort of pause when you think about that, because the idea is that genes tried to get themselves into the future, but genes have now created something that's going to kill them. And we might say this is, let's say, roughly analogous to the plot of the Terminator movie, that humans want to get themselves into the future, but in creating robots, or at least a robot from the future, however you want to work the Terminator franchise storyline, human beings have set themselves up to be destroyed by their own machines. And this is, I suppose, sort of the story of the genes, except the one is dependent upon the other. And this is where we begin to cross over into Paul King's Northland and ask some really deeper questions about, well, what in fact is the nature of us? Is the nature of us primarily genetic, or is the nature of us primarily conscious?
And so the reason I raise all of this is when you say, okay, these are patterns that are trying to move, or that selection is favoring their movement into the future. My point is they are not of symmetrical standing, right? And this is, I don't, you will understand easily, but other people will mishear. I'm not arguing that this is positive in a normative sense, but this is a...
Okay, and now Peugeot's being polite, but every time, this is where we get into Wilfrid Sellers. Every time you get into normativity, from his foundation, you have a problem. And people who are not foundational materialists have been pointing this out forever, that there is a goal that you are imagining because you say these aren't normative, that there is a source of a good that is coming apart from the evil demiurge down below, because their only value is to get their particular spellings into the future. And so Peugeot will again and again and again come back to this question, oh, foundationalist who is constructing a stairway to heaven, please tell me how you know which direction heaven is, because you're imagining this stairway has direction. What is it?
An is and not an ought. Cultural evolution, which is the thing that makes human beings special, or at least one of a pair of things that make humans very special, is superior to genes in the sense that it is much more rapidly evolving, but it is
superior. Rapidly evolving is a good thing. What if, in fact, would a world without human beings that, at least according to Bret and many of our fears, can build things like internal combustion engines and atomic bombs and other environmental hazards, which seem to destroy the genes that were our creators, is consciousness, in fact, a grand mistake? I mean, we're sort of knocking at the door of some radical environmentalist that would say, well, the world would be better without the levels of consciousness that this particular trousered ape has managed to achieve. But right there, you have to ask the question, better? And this system, and Peugeot keeps pointing out the fact, this system does not give you the evaluative tools to make that analysis. Because let's imagine that there are no asteroid strikes, and let's imagine that would it be better for, let's imagine that, let's say a watery planet revolving around a medium-sized star without any asteroid strikes develops life, but not really smart life like us, and you can just manage to have reptiles and mammals and all sorts of creatures, let's say nothing above a chimpanzee or a gorilla, let's say, and nothing above that level, so they can all be happy in the jungle, and you can have climate changes go back and forth, and all of that happened. And is that better than, let's say, us creating a civilization that lasts 10 or so thousand years with the kinds of aspects that we enjoy, and then nuking each other to death? Is a planet with millions and millions of years of less conscious life better than a planet with 10,000 years of consciously flourishing people who then self-destruct themselves according to this consciousness, which is the result of the genes? And of course, there's no consciousness above the genes to look at the genes and say, genes, don't do the conscious thing. That's a really bad idea, because you'll just destroy all of these genetic mechanisms that you are using to try to get you into the future. Can you do that math? And the way that Peugeot continues to address this is he'll ask questions like, where are you standing to make this analysis?
Inferior to genes in the sense that it is evolutionarily subservient to the objectives of the genomes. So it's much more rapidly evolving, but it is inferior to genes in the sense that...
Okay, so consciousness is superior to the genes in one respect, but it's inferior to the genes.
That it is evolutionarily subservient to the objectives of the genomes.
It's subservient to the objectives of the genomes. And this is the basis for a lot of the kinds of stuff that he likes to talk about. And this is what people go to his door or go to his podcast in order to discover, because now what we sort of have is this two-level theory. On one level, we've got this consciousness up here, and we're seeing ice cream and sex and story and music and fast cars or motorcycles and popsicles and sunsets. And we've got this consciousness that's distracted above, but down below our genes are like, ha, 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 ha. This, we know where we're sending you, except that you big-headed creatures have made atomic bombs and you're going to nuke each other, or you're going to cook the globe with CO2, or you're going to, or of course an asteroid could come and just wipe us all out, and you know the whole thing would be moot. So, but and so in his, he's always sort of working between these two ideas. And there's a section in here. Well, I'll let him talk a little bit more.
So my point is, genes are favored to move into the future, right? To lodge themselves as far in the future as possible. That's what selection favors. Selection is willing to swap out and kill off mimetic patterns, that is cultural patterns, in order to lodge genes into the future, right? So that is to say...
Okay, now slow that down. Selection is willing to kill off mimetic patterns, some of these upper register culture patterns, in order for the lower register to get itself into the future.
Take an example. If you move to Beijing, right? And you get married, you have some children, your children will speak Mandarin, right? They will speak Mandarin because it is in your genes' interest for them to speak the local language fluently, right? The part of you that speaks...
Now, he never connects that. And again, we don't necessarily want him to stop, but he might say, well, it's in your best interest to learn to speak Mandarin so you can get a girlfriend and maybe reproduce with her. Because, you know, there's all sorts of ways in which it seems like our genetics are, and our consciousness are making us sterile, but is that the reason?
English, your English-speaking nature will not struggle to survive. It will actually willingly vanish in your children and be replaced by Mandarin so that they can be effective. And this is a general pattern. The culture...
Now, this is very interesting because, of course, one of the things that if you've ever lived in at least two different cultures is, you know, that in some ways PVK that you know here on the internet is very much a creature of English. But when I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic and I spoke Spanish, there was sort of a Spanish me. And language is a very interesting thing. It's deep culturally mimetic, and language shapes our personality. And I remember learning the language, and you know, one of the things that people were saying, well, you know, you're really learning the language when you start dreaming in Spanish. And you know, of course, there are many groups of people that are multilingual, and on and on and on. But again, he's making the point that all of this is subservient to the genes somehow and their purposes. That consciousness is a strategy used by the genes to get us into the future.
Cultural traits that we have are means to a genetic end.
Right. So how do you...
Okay. Now he's going to try and go into self-sacrifice, because with self-sacrifice, let's say you throw yourself on the grenade, or you 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 only have 2 children instead of 12 because you love them, whereas the genetic thing would be to have 12 or 20 or 50 or to be Genghis Khan. And in some ways, I've used this analogy before, you sort of have the comparison between Jesus and Genghis Khan. To the best of our knowledge, Jesus never produced any biological offspring. Genghis Khan produced many. Then you have to ask the question, who was better at reproducing themselves? Right away, you get into the question, well, what is me? That's the question. What is me? Am I fundamentally a story? Am I an autobiographical narrative that I say in my head, adding to it the composites of your perceptions of me and my parents' perceptions of me, of my children's perceptions of me, and whatever things I might be able to do to manage the memeplex? And if you look at someone like Jesus of Nazareth, who managed to, in some ways, multiply himself, that's the whole idea about getting the Spirit of God and getting the Holy Spirit in Christianity, is somehow now this Spirit of Christ is going to inhabit me, and something of Jesus of Nazareth is going to live on in billions of people out through history. Or Genghis Khan with raping and wives and concubines and making sure they're very high status so that their genetic material gets into the future. And so this is the question is well, okay, which register? The upper register, mind, spirit, heaven. The lower register, matter, flesh, earth. Which actually goes? Now I'm going to jump a little bit ahead because, and even though the rapist gene is interesting because we're going to come back to that from a different video. And again, he lays this stuff out frequently. He's very consistent on this. And now you might ask yourself why. Because in some ways you might say, well, Bret is sort of adopting a Jesus strategy in terms of getting his mimetic code into the future. That's why he has a podcast. I mean, if the lower register, which comes from the organs between his legs, he's living more like Jesus than he is like Genghis. I'll just say that. I think I haven't listened carefully. I think he and his lovely wife have 2 wonderful sons who are continuing to use the Jesus strategy of getting his cultural memes out into the world, instead of the Genghis strategy of getting his genetic material, his brown eyes and his dark hair and his own self out into the world by impregnating as many females as possible. So right there, it's an interesting question. But let's hear him make his speech again, because this really is his religion. Because again, I would say that religion is not so much how the secular world has framed it, but it's much more of, let's say, of ultimate concern. It's the thing at the top of the hierarchy. Okay, it's the means by which we pursue that which is of ultimate importance or concern. That's functionally and fundamentally what religion is. And for him, well,
explain self-sacrifice in that structure. Like, how do you explain a soldier that did not serve our genes? But yeah. I don't understand. I know where mine comes from, but I wonder where yours comes from.
Because Peugeot, well, what is Peugeot? Well, Peugeot would say, well, there's emanation, there's top down, that's from heaven revealed down to us. And earth, heaven and earth meet. That's Peugeot's religion. So he many times in this conversation, he keeps asking him, please tell me where you get your value system, because, you say it's Genghis Khan, but you're living like Jesus.
Beautiful. The story is a funny one, right? So
now, I must say he's remarkably patient, because, and this is true of anyone who's trying to live like Jesus instead of Genghis, because, as that Bell Labs guy said, don't be afraid of someone stealing your new idea, because if you actually have a new idea, you'll have to beat it into their brains to get it. Why? Because we are deeply mimetic, and we tend to pick this stuff up from each other, and we usually need to be exposed to it multiple times for us to begin to sort of, again, have that memeplex out there actually get into our head well enough so that we can manipulate it and we can reproduce it. And actually the reproduction goes quite unconsciously or unself-consciously, because you find teenagers and kids do it in all the time, but to actually have something like this. So Bret has explained this again and again and again and again and again and again, and I can find numerous videos where he tries to explain this.
All evolved creatures have the identical purpose, right? Their purpose is to lodge their genes into the future.
Remember, he just said that about minute 38.
Right? Everything from malaria, plasmodium to, a red panda. They all have the same purpose, which means it's not a very...
But now, remember, that he's talking about living things. He's a biologist. Maybe only life has purpose. I don't know. Is the purpose of the sun to burn? These questions we pass over.
Very good purpose, I should point out. What they have...
Using hard words. Use the word good. That's fine. Keep going.
I mean it. I mean it in its absolutely normative sense. And I'll tell you, at the end of this, I hope you'll see where it came from.
All right. Okay.
Okay. So all those creatures, every creature, and presumably every creature on every other planet where there are creatures, which I assume there are.
And, you say religious people have faith. I know that, again, it's a huge claim he just made.
Has the same purpose, to get their informational stuff lodged as deeply in the future as possible.
And now remember, this is fundamentally material. The information is derivative. The information itself is a function of the conscious mind apprehending it. This worldview, it's going away. It's going away. I know you're trying to spread it like Jesus, but it's going away.
But the ways in which one can lodge one's informational stuff, in our case, our genes, deeply into the future, vary tremendously. That's what biological diversity is, right? It's a diversity of tools for getting genes into the future.
Now, again, tools. Well, what's a tool? A tool is something that is employed by an agent in order to pursue a purpose. It's deeply metaphorical in this case, given his worldview.
The tool that we were awarded that made humans truly special is consciousness, right? What does consciousness do? Consciousness, I believe, allows us to take two minds and to pool their different understanding of the world, their different kinds of expertise, and to basically asymmetrically parallel process difficult puzzles that neither of us could solve together. And then
Okay. He is so close to another level right there. So close. Because what these two plus genetic beings that have this toolkit of consciousness possess creates a new level. Let's call it a spirit. And we know it because you have, let's say you have a family. That family has a spirit that none of the individuals themselves are capable of containing. Okay? It's only when all of them are together that the spirit of the family is instantiated. C.S. Lewis noticed this when Charles Williams, one of the Inklings, died. And he basically said, the Inklings that were us when Charles Williams was there will never again be the same. So my younger sister passed away in 2018. She died of a heart attack suddenly. Her family, her husband and her 3 children, will never have that same spirit of the family again after she died. That spirit went away. Did it die? Is that the right word for it? So right here with this consciousness, Bret is almost there. And this is why I think the existence of his worldview is threatened, because it's already seeding the next evolutionary jump in the mimetic sphere. And the challenge is that now with this foundationalism, is it in fact necessary for it to be genetics? And this is the way that, say, Kingsnorth and Mary Harrington, and this is the way that, well, conservatism is going to get weird, because it's no, we can take this information and we can code it into computers, and computers can network together, and maybe those computers will construct a spirit. I'm dubious. But this is, he's so close to the levels here, but he doesn't seem to get there.
You can scale that up, and you can have a whole campfire of people parallel processing difficult problems, like how do we survive in this new habitat that our ancestors didn't know anything about, right? That's a tool. It's a means to an end, and the end is let's get our genes as deeply into the future as possible. However,
and now, of course, so you've got a group of high school kids in the school parking lot hanging out around a pickup truck. And now there's a separation. Now, the kids in the high school are seriously probably thinking about how they can get their genes into the future. That's just the boys in the parking lot of the school. And, and then the girls come along, and they're seriously thinking about how they can get their genes into the future. Bret, not so much with his friend. What are they really trying to get into the future? I don't think it's so much their genes. I think it's a whole lot of upper register stuff. Their values, their morality, their way of life. In fact, the entire definition of human. Now, I found this conversation between Jordan Peterson and Richard Wrangham fascinating. And this segment about fire and human development was itself just, the whole conversation was just fascinating. But now think about this conversation through the lens of Bret's worldview. And now I'm not trying to troll anybody or set anything up here, but because it should fit, but does it?
Indications of 30-50% increase in the number of calories. I mean, this is huge, for farmers. Right. 5% more milk out of their cows, they're a millionaire. And now we're talking, some tens of percent.
Right. Essential, a doubling of available calories. And you also pointed out not only the caloric improvement, but the radical decrease in the amount of time it takes to do the processing, like the chewing.
This is all about cooking food. It's about fire. And it's about fire, let's say, as the great leap forward, unlike the one that Mao tried.
Right.
So yes.
So this would be really big, and I think the argument that I make about why this happened surely at 2 million years ago is kind of twofold. One is that everything fits at that point. So that's the point at which you see smaller mouths, smaller teeth, evidence of smaller guts, to judge from the shape of the ribs and the pelvis. And by the way, for the first time, a commitment to sleeping on the ground, because for the first time you have a construction of the organism, the human, in a way that is not easy to climb trees.
So that made it possible for us to not have to climb trees. That's the idea, at least in part.
Yeah, and the Australopithecines could climb trees, so they surely would have slept in trees. But humans nowadays, you can't imagine them being able to regularly climb up into trees and always be able to make a nest in the way that a chimpanzee or an Australopithecine could. So they'd have to sleep on the ground often. Well, you have to be nuts to sleep on the ground if you don't have fire to protect you. So I think everything, that all points to why it makes sense that fire was first controlled around 2 million years ago, literally about 1.9, and the 1.9 million years ago. And then the other reason is that subsequently to that point, no dramatic events happen in human evolution which could be consistent with the acquisition of something so important as the control of fire. So
we might say that, well, the great mistake made by the genes was producing an animal that could control fire. Because once fire got controlled, then suddenly all of these domestication aspects that he talked about earlier in the video, are smaller teeth and smaller jaws and flatter faces and smaller noses and on and on and on and on, are the changes in our physiology. But now pay attention to what we're doing here. The changes in our physiology. And what have we done here? We have implicitly created a lineage in which we share an identity with whatever it is 2 million years ago in this story that made fire, or could control fire, or could produce fire. And, hey, fair enough, we don't see the chimps using it. And the chimps have that big barrel belly because they have to have all those guts, and they have to spend all of their time chewing leaves. We don't see the gorillas using it. We don't, in fact, see any other creature in the world using fire, just us. And then suddenly I can pull a Jordan Peterson's here and say, no, wait a minute. Doesn't God in the book of Exodus call himself a consuming fire? And when he shows up to Moses, isn't he a burning bush? And isn't fire the thing in the altar that the substitutionary animal has to go in? And, this fire point is a really interesting point. But pay attention. We were there 2 million years ago making fire. Now, if I'd say, was that Homo sapien? They say, oh, no. Humans in the form that we have are, they're only, 250,000, 300,000 years old, something like that. And of course, when we talk about human civilization, well, you've got some ancient cave drawings and some of those kind of things, but civilization doesn't really seem to get going until once you have agricultural revolution and yada, 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 yada. And so where's this we? Does this fire controlling being, is that being more like us, or is Adolf Hitler more like us? Well, it depends on what aspect, because, somehow we slowly lost our capacity to climb trees. And, children climb trees, and it's so this whole idea that we're in our human development, we're slowly, we march through the epics of other levels of development. But again, just pay attention to our language and what we're saying here, because is it this 2 million year ago fire controlling being that Bret Weinstein is wishing to extend into the future? No, I wouldn't say that. It's us. Well, what is us? I mean, when you keep poking at this thing, a lot of interesting things begin to emerge from it.
However, that tool allows us to do something, which is to understand the universe around us in abstract terms that we can transmit. Right?
Now, with that 2 million years ago, 1.9 million years ago, fire controlling, could that do what he just said?
Right. So we can have conversations. And what that means is that we are actually, to my way of thinking, we are effectively robots. We are aqueous machines with aqueous computers on our shoulders that have discovered that we have a purpose we cannot defend, right? My purpose is to get my genes into the future.
You can't defend acting like Genghis-Khan. Genghis-Khan, who didn't live anywhere near as long ago as the 1.9 million year old fire controlling being, Genghis-Khan didn't even feel the need to defend getting his genes into the future. And by virtue of something happened far more recently in the story that now makes this fella say that Genghis Khan's strategy of getting his genes into the future is indefensible. I wonder if someone would write a book about something like that. Well, let's continue.
Sometimes one gets their genes into the future by putting some other population into gas chambers. But I don't ever want to do that. In fact, I would rather not be than engage in that behavior.
So something has even gotten into this guy, that something only not very long ago, because one of the fun things to do is read. And one of the fun things to do is read unauthorized books or naughty books, and I don't mean the kinds with pictures of creatures that you might, in a Genghis Khan way, want to get your genes into the future with. But let's say pre-World War II scientific books that had a lot of talk about getting genes into the future and superior genes and inferior genes. And they had all sorts of levels of morality in that. And in fact, all of those ideas sort of kind of launched those gas chambers to get other people into them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what's remarkable here is that I don't think Bret is thinking, well, we want to get Nazi genes into the future. Because, of course, it's those genes underneath that are, without the knowledge, except the specific gnosis, the revelation, that this is where, again, Bret is sort of Gnostic, the revelation that he is giving us that's not the kind of being we want in the future. And so to get a preferred being into the future, what we really need is people with the right genes that are going to manifest the right consciousness, that's going to have the right brain to get the right ideas of better and good into the future. That's what we need, because we're not really quite sure about these genes underneath, but we're going to have to do this because that's good, and we know that's good, even though obviously Hitler is in disagreement, and Mao is in disagreement, and Stalin is in disagreement, and, well, FDR is in agreement. So are we really getting the genes of FDR into the future, but not his genes? No, not the lower register chemistry. We're trying to get his ideas into the future. And not the fire controller of 1.9 million years ago, and not Genghis Khan. The whole question of identity just has this thing unravel.
Therefore, I'm not necessarily, the person I am is not on board with the program, which is get your genes into the future by any means necessary.
Tell me of this person. Is he physical? Or because this person, I think, can be multiplied through words, through talking. We might even say through preaching. And it's through preaching that spirit might go forth into other listening. How can they be transformed into these persons unless they hear the spirit coming through the language and the consciousness coming together and a new consciousness going on top? I don't think his Gnosticism can last.
And what's more, I know that if I talk to other individuals and I say, let me ask you a question. Your purpose is to get your genes deeply lodged into the future, but there are circumstances in which that is done with a gas chamber. Are you on board with the gas chamber thing, or are you not?
Why not? I mean, gas chambers, I mean, basically, what was it? Oh yeah, I was listening to so I listened to The Rest is History about Operation Barbarossa. Oh yeah, I was going to play that for some of this, because that it was lovely episode about the levels, because basically Hitler thought, well, we're superior, we're genetically superior to those Slavs, and so just like we did to the French, we'll go into Operation Barbarossa. But problem was that Russia is massive, and there aren't gas stations, and Germany didn't have rather a unified mobile economy that produced millions and millions of cars with interchangeable parts. And so they had all these, in fact, a lot of the vehicles that they used to invade the Soviet Union were basically stripped and robbed from the French. And so they had all these different kinds of trucks and vehicles, and then they didn't have spare parts, and then they didn't have gasoline, and the Operation Barbarossa came completely apart. But when you asked Hitler, they were just sort of fudging it all and saying, no, it's German will because we're the superior race. And, well, no, they didn't get their genes into the future too good.
Well, I know that the people I value most highly will say, of course I'm not.
But what aspects of the people you value most highly? Are those with the right proportion of shoulder to hips, and with the hair that shows that they're sexually reproductive? No, those aren't the people you value. You value the upper register people. You value the people who have their identity from the words that you speak and the spirit that you create in your consciousness one level up, and that they agree with you and they come together. That's who you value. You are way more Jesus than Genghis Khan.
And so the point is, if we really mean that, then what we are effectively, we are like the Terminator. We have discovered that we have a purpose. And the question is, do we like that purpose? And if not, what if we say, all right, I'm chucking out the purpose and I'm going to replace it with one that's actually worthy of me?
All right, so what if I told you...
And well, that means a great degree of autonomy by this conscious. And I will grant you that because, again, you talk way more like Jesus than like Genghis Khan. And that, to me, is your religion is far closer to Jesus' religion than Genghis Khan. And even though you're further away from Jesus historically than Genghis Khan, and it seems like the spirit of Jesus and has been moving through time and, in fact, has convinced you. Now, I guess we can let Jonathan talk here, but he's not going to make much headway. In fact, he's not going to make hardly any headway.
That purpose that you're describing, the purpose of consciousness, like that's actually the primary purpose. And it honestly,
that's the one that comes from above. What does Jesus say? Jesus says, well, John 3 with Nicodemus, you must be born from above. You must be born with this purpose from above that says no to purposes below. And an Orthodox Christian is going to wade in with the very Pauline, the good that I would do, I would not do. It's the epithumias that I am attending to triumph over, etc., etc., etc. Peugeot is going to say, it's all coming from above, my friend, not below, because you have no way of saying from below where this comes from. The Jordan Peterson guy, he was trying a little bit more, but
honestly has been that from the moment that humans can speak and from the moment that humans have consciousness. And that once you understand that, then you will look at religious through that lens, through the lens of people, because you seem to think that that's happening now, but I don't think it's happening now. I think that what humans have realized a very long time ago is that we have a higher purpose, and how that higher purpose is slowly forming itself and slowly kind of becoming clearer and clearer. I mean, I think that we can see that happening through, let's say, the history of religion, but I think that that's what's in religion, and that it's something that has been there from the beginning. And if you try to understand religion only through the perpetuation of genes, but then you tell me we have to have another purpose, which is this, you're basically telling me we need to exist together in love, is what you're saying. And so I would say that that's really what, let's say, it's at least the latest religions have been saying. And they do argue about how to do it. They argue about certain aspects of it, but there's a sense in which that's what religion has been from the beginning.
Well, yes and no. I believe that religions are this looking inward, but they are not this looking outward because of their lineage nature. And so my real message is, and
once he says it's a message, he's already betrayed the demiurge down below. The real message of Genghis Khan, hey, you want my real message? It's right here for you. That's Genghis Khan. This guy wants to preach like Jesus.
I think you've heard me talk about it, and you and I have talked about it. I have no antipathy for religion, right? I think we have a problem, which is that our religions, because they are the product of evolution, are not a good match for a world in which everything is novel.
What isn't a product of evolution? So where are you getting your solutions for a world that's novel? Because isn't this novel world also a product within your world of evolution? There's nothing around us that isn't a product of evolution. And so then you have the question, where will we get the saving something to rescue us from this demon below? I mean, you start retranslating this stuff and it's like Christianity's kind of taken over because that's very translatable in Christian terms.
But from the perspective of what these things are, they are the key that allowed our ancestors to get us to the present, right? These things that allowed people to collaborate in these large lineages, right, are the key to our success. But we have come to a point at which we now have a bunch of religions that are incompatible, that, you know, we can pretend they all say the same thing, but they don't. They say some similar things, which is not surprising. There's effectively convergent evolution that has shaped many of the beliefs. But in essence, I think, and you know, this is the bitter pill.
Again, there's a lot of slippery stuff in here. I talked about this in my Sunday school class. Like, all religions are the same. Well, what about those Heaven's Gate people? You know, the aliens were coming, so they all off themselves. So, no, that's not what I mean. Well, what do you mean? Well, like Islam and Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism and Hinduism and they're all the same. But they're not acting like they're all the same. They've got a degree of they search for a common language to talk amongst themselves, to look for truth, yada yada yada. But again, and then his whole argument about, well, suddenly they're obsolete. And I've talked about this before. And it's like, oh, were they obsolete in 1950? Or in 1900, or in 1850, or is it 2020, or is it 2013, or is it 9/11 that they were obsolete? You know, and which parts of them are obsolete, and how do we know that they're obsolete? And again, he's got the gnosis that, well, it just shows that they're obsolete because we're in danger now of not getting what exactly, again, into the future? The 1.9 million year old fire making being that we can't find because he or she is inside of us? Or the Genghis Khan? Or the Jesus? So this is, I can go on and on and on like this, but this is basically the terminal point of most conversations with Bret. Now, what I'm going to play, Esther pointed out to me, and I found it quite remarkable. Now, this is from the 125th Dark Horse podcast live stream where they talk about abortion. And this shocked me, given what he had said before. And as much as Heather tries to sort of walk him back, he sticks to his guns.
We can set the stage properly.
Okay.
As evolutionary biologists, we are aware of the importance that genes play in the evolutionary story. That is inherent. Understanding what the genes are up to is fundamental to unpacking a question surrounding human reproduction and modern tech and all of that. You have to understand what the genes are trying to do.
Okay, and so in a sense, the genes are below and Bret is above, and this is the religion that he is revealing to us to help us understand what the genes are up to.
In order to figure out how to position yourself to defeat them when they're up to no good, etc., right?
Okay, so in a sense, we're sort of the gods above who are doing the judging to decide when the genes are up to no good so we can defeat them. But again, you always have to bear in mind what he said before about the fact that the genes are always in there seeking their ends. Yet we're supposed to be seeing them in order to defeat them, but they are us, and we don't know if our strategies to defeat them are really their strategies of fooling us, and so what you're sort of left to is again some sort of higher knowledge that the emanation doesn't start from heaven and goes down here. It's only about, I don't know how tall Bret is, 5'10", 5'10" and below.
In no way am I or are we advocating that we do what the genes want done. In fact, we have very directly said we have an obligation. The genes are amoral. What they want is to get into the future.
Like Genghis Khan.
Many of the ways that they get into the future are utterly horrifying and must be opposed for moral reasons. Some of the ways that they want...
But again, for moral reasons, well, source of this morality, it's just self-evident.
To get into the future are utterly beautiful and should be amplified. It's an a la carte world. We have to choose the things that the genes want that we should agree with, and we have to choose the things that we are forced to oppose for moral reasons.
But we never know when we are choosing and when the genes are choosing. How could we? Especially when we're in groups, especially when we're in lineages. Could we ever be sure that it's not the genes? Well, maybe, you know, maybe we should castrate ourselves. Maybe then that part of our, none of this coheres.
So please don't take anything I'm saying here, because I'm pointing out what the genes are up to, as indicating that I am in any way suggesting we go along with it. But there's an argument I never hear about the question of abortion, reproductive rights, etc.
It's an argument we never hear, but tell me more, because I've heard a lot of arguing about this in my lifetime, trust me.
Frequently talk about the need, which some people don't recognize, for an exception to any limit on abortion in the case of rape, right? You and I believe firmly that there has to be an exception. I believe it goes beyond that. This is not that, in fact, the argument for an exception is effectively absolute from a genetic perspective. And the reason for that is that there has been so much rape in human history that we all, every single living human, carries the genetic potential, right? Many of us carry it.
Especially those who have been the product of Genghis Khan's rape genes. Genghis Khan's rape genes must be some of the best rapey genes around.
We're just carriers, right? We don't transmit it because decent upbringing and all make this a non-issue. Many of us are also women, effectively incapable of rape. Okay?
What about seduction? You know, because here's the problem with our consciousness selves that are picking and choosing morality. You know, yeah, seduction. I talked to lots of guys who, well, she didn't have a gun. She didn't have a knife. She couldn't really threat upper body pummeling. What she did was colonize my desire. And she wielded a far more powerful weapon. And I gave her my seed. And then later I regretted it. So what am I to make of that? Should we? Oh, this just doesn't go.
But the point is, the genetic potential for rape exists in us because there's been so much rape in human history. And one of the great successes of society is in reducing the amount of it dramatically. By punishing it severely and pursuing instances of it, we drive the amount of it down. Which is,
so we have this vast thing called society, and that society is reducing rape. Well, which societies? Are some societies more rapey than others? Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know, you can read, you know, at the end of the book of Judges when, you know, they kind of slaughtered the tribe of Benjamin because the tribe of Benjamin didn't express hospitality in a very Sodom and Gomorrah way. And then well, there weren't any, they had to somehow, they needed wives, and so kidnap, and there's a lot of that in history. There's a lot of that in all of our cultures. So,
It's great, and we should do better. But here's the question. If we do not carve out an exception for a woman who has been raped, right? If we compel a woman to give birth to a child, and we say, well, why punish the child, for the sins of the father? Well, it's not a question of punishing the child. Presumably, you should want that abortion as early as possible. There is no child. There's a potential child, but there's no child, and there is a woman, right? She needs to be protected. But more to the point, if you force raped people to give birth to the children that have been produced by this act, you are creating a conduit for any genetic predisposition towards rape to use this strategy to spread itself.
Holy cow. So maybe we should compel women who have been raped to abort their children, because we don't want to pass on the rapey genes. Now Heather's going to try and walk this back, but Heather should have been a little more forceful, because, how many million people have Genghis-Khan rapey genes? And, we're knocking on the door of eugenics with this one.
Right? We cannot open that door, right? We have to keep that door closed. And the way you keep that door closed is you provide the opportunity for anyone who finds themselves in that terrible predicament to terminate the pregnancy, so that rapists are not rewarded, that their strategy cannot work, right? Rape is a strategy for putting your genes into the future by overriding someone else's consent.
Mm-hmm.
So again, what's interesting, if you track this in terms of upper and lower register, consent is what he cares about. He cares about suffering. Genes don't care about your suffering. If genes cared about our suffering, why on earth would childbirth be so painful? Genes don't care. He's protecting upper register. He's totally upper register. But this argument is very much gets us back to some sort of eugenics argument. So yeah, don't let those rapey genes move forward. Well, what other genes can't we let move forward?
Right? And we cannot allow the genes to find that mechanism, and we cannot allow rapists to figure out how to exploit it, right? It has to be a zero-profit strategy, and that requires that exception.
Or should we mandate again? Because, well, rape a girl, get an abortion. One of the things that, in this whole rape and in this whole rape argument, I always think about David and Bathsheba. Was that a rape? Did Bathsheba have a choice? Now, what level of rape are we going to be concerned about? Is it going to be rape at gunpoint, rape with a knife, rape with, or will it be, honey, if you'd like a promotion, you should sleep with me? Now, come on, Heather, walk it back. But she didn't do it hard enough.
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought about it in those terms before. And I think, I didn't know where you were going. And I didn't expect that from you, in part because you and I both, unlike what people expect from evolutionary biologists in general, tend to find genetic explanations for human behavior in many fewer places than most people, including many non-evolutionary biologists. Like, really, we are so much more software, that is to say culture and consciousness, than we are hardware, which is to say genetics,
but not in this argument.
Explains so much of what we are behaviorally, that you will very rarely hear either of us make an argument that there might be a genetic basis for behavior X. And in fact, you didn't argue that there is, or that it is strongly genetically heritable. What you argued is,
he certainly seemed to assume it, or at least there's zero. We can't run the risk of the rapey genes going forward.
Given that there might be, and it's also true that even if it's not genetic, that there might be something epigenetically that is conveyed, methylation or something, right? That that there is an additional reason to always allow whatever other restrictions there might be, and I would hope that there would be none up through at least the end of the first trimester and perhaps halfway through the second trimester on abortions, that rape victims are allowed exemptions to any restrictions on abortion.
Well, when we do our genetic testing, what other genes don't we want in the future? The couple, let's say they're rolling the dice, and let's say, well, we don't want someone bald, because head and all.
That there are, although, again, I'm not, there will be gray area somewhere later on.
In theory, the nice thing about having a husband and wife team is that, in my experience, sometimes wives can say things to their husbands that no one else will dare to say. Heather, you're letting us down here. You gotta say stop. No, we're not gonna go the eugenics way with respect to the rapey genes.
We can time, right? In the development of the fetus, the zygote fetus baby.
So you're absolutely right. I don't think that there's liable to be. So when we talk about heritable, we're talking about the differences between individuals, and that matters here for reasons that will be obscure to most people. But the point is, you have to have a difference between individuals in their propensity to engage in this strategy at the genetic level in order for it to be heritable in this sense.
Right.
I'm not arguing that I think those things exist. I'm arguing that they might, and I'm arguing that if they do, they can't become an advantage or they will be elaborated. So you're right.
So therefore, even if there's a possibility, we should stop it. I'm not sure this is an improvement on his argument, because how many other possibilities don't we have? He's just making his argument worse.
So exactly why I structured it the way I did. Yep. But I would also point out that given what you and I do believe, which is that, human genes are spectacularly unique in one important regard, which is that they create a mind in which all of the important stuff of humanity takes place on the software side, not the hardware side.
Yep.
There's his religion. Again, like I said, if you listen to him, you'll hear him say it again and again and again and again. This is his religion.
The strange and amazing thing about the human genome. But even given that, and even given what it says about where these propensities are housed, the same argument still applies, right? A rapist who, whether he consciously understands what he's up to or not, is getting off on the idea of having sex with some fertile person and her dealing with the consequences and him walking away. That person needs to know that there is no product of his...
That person needs to know upper register. Again, he's preaching like Jesus, but stating that Genghis Khan is the one determining
his activity that the state is going to force into being.
Okay, so to your credit, I think you do a terrible job caricaturing the mind of a rapist.
That's a very clever line. That was a very clever line. Come on, Heather, you got to lean on him harder here.
But I hear the arguments that will come back, like, rape isn't about sex; it's about power. Wrong. But
no, that's not the argument.
No one's thinking about whether she's fertile or not. It's like, I don't care what's in the conscious mind of
that's not the argument.
The rapist, right. And I am quite certain that almost no rapist ever has had anything like the kinds of thoughts that you just imagined were in their mind.
Genghis Khan might have.
Not consciously. That doesn't mean that the strategy doesn't exist. Well, let me take away the two negatives. Still, the strategy does exist because it has functioned that way.
Okay, but where does that strategy exist? It doesn't exist. It exists in a spirit. Might not exist in a mind, but it does exist in a spirit. It's the spirit that Bret has been talking about the whole time.
regardless of what has been conscious in rapists' minds.
Yeah, so I'll say it yet a third way, which is something excites the rapist, and to the
And you're not improving it.
extent that it might be the prospect that the state is going to effectively side with them. No, the state has to side with the woman. It's unambiguous, and the degree, let's put it this way, the absurdity of the religious position that would have to exist, and I know it does in some minds, but if you've thought about this issue, right, who exactly is this God that would cause one person to rape another and then condemn the raped person to give birth to the offspring of the rapist? Now, I'm not...
So is the demiurge, is the pro-life position a product of the demiurge? This evil genetic demiurge that's trying to get our spelling into the future?
Arguing
God loves her less?
Right. What the hell? What kind of God are we talking about? Or, you know...
The demiurge loves her if she's fertile. That's what the demiurge cares about.
Did your God create a universe in which things happen and they put us in circumstances where we have to make uncomfortable judgments, and this is one of those things?
Right.
You know,
that's almost a appalling question. What it did right there was the pivot. I don't know if he pivoted to give a little bit of defense for Judaism, Christianity, Islam, let's say, but you know, there's a lot of debate in especially in places like 1 Corinthians whether or not Pauline is quoting his rivals. Paul is quoting his rivals, but of course there's no quotation marks in Greek, so
I feel like almost all religious people would have to recognize that if they came to the table and looked at the actual, not just the issue that they're focused on, but the other issues that it is in tension with. And in this case, there clearly are other issues.
Indeed.
Heather, you should have pulled him back from that one. That was see, and part of the difficulty with this position is, again, the threat of eugenics, because the genes are, you know, Heather tried to walk it back, but not so much so. So this is Bret's religion, and I think Jonathan understands Bret's religion, but I don't know the degree to which Bret sees the problem in it. So we'll see. I think at this point, this is the last commentary on this video. I'm not going to walk through the whole thing because in many ways, the whole conversation is Bret laying out his religion as I did, and Jonathan saying, yeah, but where does the upper register, where do you get your morality from? I don't know if they'll get beyond that impasse, because the question, so in many respects, you know, part of what Jordan Peterson is trying to do, let's say, in this video with the primatologist, is try to get at a morality from below. And that, of course, once you have a solely emergent system, then somehow your morality is also going to have to emerge from below. But I think that really doesn't finally solve any of your problems, or it doesn't solve all of your problems. So, yeah, let me know what you think.